Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Love That Loves You Back, a podcast between myself, Valerie Kabov, and my dear friend, Jonathan Fremantle. I'm an artistic miscreant, otherwise known as a self-described third-generation art professional, who's currently raising a fourth-generation art professional, born in the depths of the Pale of Settlement in the former Soviet Union, and partly raised in Australia, lived and worked in London and Paris, and 15 years ago, by a quirk of fate, relocated to Zimbabwe, where I'm the co-founder of First Floor Gallery Harare, trying to figure out life, education, art, and predominantly love of art as life goes on. And without further ado, over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, Jonathan Fremantle. I grew up in Cape Town and studied in London. I did a long apprenticeship in fine art in the old sense, and have been more making art in one way or another ever since then. I live in Edinburgh now, but I also lived for a while in Johannesburg, where I had Hazard Gallery, and that was the context that I met Valerie about 10, 12 years ago, and just loved the conversation we had immediately about painting and how painting is everything. And that conversation's been a constant source of joy and sustenance over the years. So it does make sense that we share the conversation, and look forward to where this goes.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it usually goes anywhere and everywhere, but somehow we always come back to art, and
Yeah,
because it is the love that loves us back. Thank you very
right.
much for joining us, and we look forward to sharing the journey. Good morning, good afternoon, everywhere and everyone. We have a very special second guest to a program, a Zimbabwean who's a painter who's been concerned with Zimbabwe in many ways, in many different ways. Helen Teede, who's also a bicontinental painter perennially. And one of the interesting points for us in inviting Helen is that, in a way, she is somebody who is very reflective of a real life, and kind of presenting herself as a real person and a human being in her practice, in a way that is often obscured in other artists' practices. And so I think it's a really interesting conversation about the reality of artists' lives. And in Helen's case, it's particularly poignant right now because she's had a baby 6 months ago and is processing motherhood both in her process and in her practice. And so one of the things that I was interested in asking Helen is, a lot of artists are very precious about their process, and there's so much affectation being put on the purity or vulnerability of process in an artist's practice, and you've had to just explode your whole entire process by having a child. So what was that like, and what perspective has it given you on your own practice?
Yeah, so there's this video on YouTube where Agnes Martin is talking about her process, and I'm sure you've both watched it, where she's kind of sitting in the corner of her studio and saying, I sit and I wait all day, as long as it takes for the inspiration to arrive. And I found that really inspiring, and I used to do that quite a lot, sit a lot and just stare. Yeah, I don't do that anymore at all. Because there's just it doesn't work. And I kind of now in the past 6 months, the whole process has kind of changed, because you have to kind of switch flow or whatever on and off, just like that, in between having to attend to the child, breastfeeding, whatever. And it kind of makes things more urgent and more deliberate, which is really interesting, because it's been a really hard shift to do, but I think it actually makes painting more, I don't know, it's like every mark has to carry everything about what you want to say, and you don't have time to mess around with lots of marks or whatever, really. And so I kind of think that the way I paint is fundamentally changed, because it's more very much more conscious in the studio, and then all the thinking and sitting kind of happens when I'm with the baby, because there's a lot of kind of, even if you're playing with the baby, there's a lot of empty time because you're doing things on repeat a lot. So there's a lot of brain space there to think about things. And so yeah, everything is way more polluted. And I also started looking at a lot of other artists who have children. So I was when I was in Margate, one of my friends who's an artist, Mercedes, has 3 kids, and her whole life is an art. Her studio pollutes into her home, and her kids are always in her studio, and there's this much more fluid overlap, which also reading artists' parents' biographies seems to happen much more than, for example, I don't know, the biographies of Rothko and Philip Guston, for example, who sort of spend a lot of time away from the world. And I don't know, I prefer this overlap. I think it's a bit more, I don't know, more democratic in a way, or less like the painter genius in the ivory tower. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's actually, for me, it's very interesting because I think your work has acquired, a lot of immediacy, right? And it's almost like there's been the meditational layer that stands between the audience and the artist has been kind of eroded, and we do get more insight into your vulnerability. But it also occurred to me that you've also concurrently have been working a lot with pure pigment, which is kind of interesting because that also pigment, is something that is an unmediated color, right? And I wonder whether that's also resonates with this approach, with this kind of transformation, like not, that sense of urgency as well. And I think like pigment does communicate a sense of urgency and directness in a way. It literally just occurred to me. But do you see that that's also part of it?
I think that that's kind of a quirk of fate, I suppose, because I started working with raw pigment after having been to see some exhibitions in Paris with you. And we saw that Rothko show that I think you actually talk about in a previous podcast, and also the Peter Doig show. And we bumped into a Rothko specialist there who talked about how Rothko used pure pigment. And I already knew that Doig uses raw pigment a lot. And then when I came back to Margate, we just happened to do a studio visit to an artist, Sophie von Hellemann's studio, and she had pigment all over the floor and she was using it. So then I asked her and she told me where to source it, gave me a lot of resources, and then I started working with it pretty much at the same time that I felt pregnant. Which I don't think that it's coincidental, but it was definitely not, conscious.
Definitely
choice.
very it's very obvious that your relationship with color isn't decorative. It seems to me that the colors you use are pretty electric, and there's the sort of zingy greens and the alizarins, even though they refer to organic elements like landscapes and the body. They've got this electric element to them. They're kind of pretty intense. And even with the recent works, these beautiful paintings you've done as a mother, of self-portraits, astonishing paintings, by the way. The chromatic intensity is dampened, but there's still the feeling of that zingy color in them. They're not neutrals. They're just kind of like they're a very fluorescent jumper that's been in 20 washes. You know, they have a remnant of that intensity. And I guess I wondered, the question I really wanted to ask you, put a painter to painter, is your relationship with color. Is it something that comes primary, or is it something that you discover through the act of painting? You know, are you working from a kind of instinct, or are you working from a palette that you kind of pre-selected? If that makes sense.
I think that it comes down to materiality, really, because before working with pigment, it was very much instinctual. I kind of, I would never prepare a palette of colors. But I suppose over the years, learning how oil paint works, you can kind of indulge more in making instinctual choices. Whereas I suppose, 10 years ago, it was probably more strategic. I don't remember. But now, since I've been using pigment, I've had to become a bit more strategic, because pigment behaves in very strange ways. Like the personalities of each color, it's not only about the color and the kind of resonance of what you see, it's also about the physical properties of how it behaves. And so for example, if there's a pigment that's much lighter in terms of weight, it bleeds and takes over from a heavier pigment because it moves faster. And also the translucency and opacity of raw pigments is way more volatile, and the range is way more pronounced than with oil paint out of a tube. And also the tinting strength and stuff. And I think that oil paint companies probably, to create a more uniform kind of, to make it easier to work with oil paints, there's more uniformity in the way they behave. Because they're mixed with linseed oil mostly. Yes. And then I think a color that has more tinting strength, they put less pigment in, so that you have more of a uniformity. So it's much easier to work with them than raw pigments that are crazily volatile. And so I've had to learn about the personality of each pigment by making tests in the studio. So there I have to be more strategic, because I've ruined so many paintings by just accidentally putting a pigment that takes over everything. Yes. But I think that over time, the more I know about them, the more instinctual the choices will become. So it's almost like while you're learning, you have to be more strategic, but then gradually you can let go of that.
No, I get that. To kind of complete my inquiry into your color, your tendency towards these electric colors, is that been something that you've had throughout your journey as a painter, or do you feel like you're working towards them? I'm just trying to scroll back into when I first encountered your work. It felt like the palette was a bit more kind of Canaletto, and it's got a bit more high vis jacket.
I don't know.
No?
You know, I remember suggesting, or maybe it's partly my fault for suggesting some spray paint at a certain stage.
Good suggestion.
No, I think that
everything's better with spray paint.
Spray paint is great. When I was in 2008, for example, all of my paintings are kind of earth tones completely. But I don't know, I think that it was that painting is painting because it can do more. Yeah. So you can, I don't know, you can paint what you see, but you can do more with paint because you can, I don't know, play with color more. And that's where I suppose when you're kind of creating a bridge between what's happening internally and in your imagination and your mind's eye and what's happening in front of you, and that you can kind of create that bridge using color.
Yeah.
So, and I think, yeah, like Monk is a really good example of this, where he was like kind of renowned for being like really experimental for color for his time. And I think also his paintings are quite interior. There's like a strong dialogue between the interior and like dreamlike space, and but clearly he's painting something he's seen or is looking at, because you can really feel and there's this sort of bridge that he creates using paint, like using painting as the primary driving force for that.
Yeah, so, no, I can see that in your work for sure. Yeah.
To get back to pigment though, and interior and emotion, I also and Monk, I'm also feeling that since you started working pigments, the role of art history or conversation has become more prominent in your work, and I think it's just for me it's been something that I've been sort of reflecting on also as a space of self-determination in your practice, in a sense that while you're painting what you like the way you like, and it so happens that art history is really, really important, and that conversation is really important for you in a way that may not have been, or you may not have felt confident about articulating in the past for various reasons. I'm just wondering whether that's also a case.
Yeah, so I think that kind of comes down to ego of the younger painter, because 10 years ago, I was not barely making any references to art history. And I think, when you're much younger, you kind of have this idea that your voice is sufficient, your own voice, and relevant. And it's really like, as you kind of, I mean, I'm not saying I'm an older painter, but that was sort of 10 years ago, let's say. Whereas now it's like very obvious to me that my own voice is pretty much irrelevant and that what's important is your voice in dialogue with other voices and a community. It's kind of a social decision, I suppose, because like having this intertextuality in painting for me is kind of what makes it really exciting. And when I see it in other people's work, that's a big part of what excites me about the work, is this idea that there's kind of a subterranean constant conversation going on in art. And I'm not only talking about painting, but all kind of forms of art. There's this kind of river dialogue, and then it erupts into a painting, or when you see it in painting, it's like an eruption that happens above the surface, and it takes a lot of the pressure off as well, because you're kind of like, okay, I'm a voice in a sea of voices. It doesn't matter, but also it's kind of also more important because you're engaging in a dialogue.
When I look at your work, and I particularly the last sort of few years, and there's this beautiful arc of an artist discovering their voice. It's wonderful to see. It's really inspiring as another artist. And I like what you say about your relationship with art history and how you discover that kind of that dialogue with the ancients, and how vital that becomes as you start to gain your own voice. Ironically, you start to refer to these other voices. You almost have the ability to hear them. And it's so clear that you do that. And I was just wondering, it's a kind of one-liner question, but I ask myself this sometimes. Do you see yourself as an ancient being making a kind of in dialogue with a contemporary? Or do you see yourself as a kind of contemporary being in dialogue with these ancients? I'm really talking about the ancients being these artists that you're talking about from the beginning.
Yeah. Interesting question. I think that suggests that it's a linear trajectory, the question. And you know, a kind of chronological like line, but I kind of see it more as a cyclical thing. When I was in Italy, I was studying this art historian, A.B. Warburg, who did this amazing analysis of Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Primavera and Spring.
Yes.
And basically, he kind of shows how woven into these paintings are a crazy amount of classical references. And his argument is that art happens, there's a cyclical nature to art, and that, yeah, again, like these kind of eruptions that happen from centuries before happen in the happen in the contemporary, which in Botticelli's time was kind of carries on in this cyclical thing. And so kind of, I suppose I see myself as just riding on one of these cycles, I don't know really where. And well, not me, but my work.
But isn't it also a case where, you know, time in our space is irrelevant, because the joy is that you can choose the conversation and the time frame for your conversation at will, right? You know, today I'm choosing to talk to Edward Munch, and tomorrow I'll choose to talk to Botticelli. And again, it's kind of a reminder of how art is also a reminder of the fact that time is a construct, that because our art conversations don't need a time frame. I mean, the important ones don't, and I think it's sort of an articulation. And I think this is why it's interesting the way you have that conversation with art history as opposed to other artists who feel like this is an appropriate political moment or a moment to politicize and accuse art history of being responsible for sins of society, which is like, to me, it's a reach. And also because we do live at a time where history is discounted, you know, to our own demerit very frequently. And so this, you know, your conversation with art history kind of becomes politically relevant because it is bucking the trend, or bucking the position, the zeitgeist, in a way, which says you either accuse art history or you appropriate it to satirize it. You know, there's often, like, I mean, art history has become a political scapegoat, starting with the people throwing, soup at Mona Lisa, right? So it's become a very convenient scapegoat for a lot of politics. And it's really beautiful to see a conversation that wants to step outside this kind of very literal, conventional, and I would say primitive approach to things. So, I mean, I'm interested to see where it goes also. I mean, you don't know either, right?
No. But I kind of think, well, definitely the painters I'm interested in art history, I kind of think that they had the same political conceptual concerns that we have as humanity today, because I mean, oppression and injustice works from the same playbook, more or less. Even though we live in a very different world, the core of it is quite similar. So I think that engaging with, you were saying that art history gets used as a scapegoat, but actually I kind of think that engaging with art history is kind of a political choice, because you're engaging with a dialogue that's ongoing. Yeah, I suppose painting is at the end of the day a bid for freedom. So what they were doing that.
It's looking at the human essential, right? And that's that interface that you're dealing with. And it's and to get back to the idea of, like, I guess, palpable humanity, it's a question that I get asked a lot about your work, and that I think a lot of people don't readily understand about your work, that is ongoing dichotomy in your practice, the way you engage with your environment, right? So historically, at least, until the work that you make in Zimbabwe is palpably different to the work that you make when you're outside of Zimbabwe or in Europe. And this first became very clear to me when you were in Venice for your master's, and you started engaging with figuration, whereas previously your work was very focused on the landscape, and landscape is a very, emotional space, let's just say that. And then all of a sudden your work became very austere and minimal and figurative at the same time. And a lot of people, and that has kind of been a ongoing process and a conversation between two parts of your work. And the way that I've reconciled it is, in the way that I speak to people about your work, is to say, well, when people, if you're a human being as an artist, then you're responsive to your environment and you respond to the things that are more present for you in that environment. And in Venice, there are not a lot of trees, for example, really not a lot of trees. Whereas in Harare, there's hella trees, so it doesn't make any sense for an artist to absent themselves from their environment and their experience when making work, right? And is that something that you think about consciously, or is it that you allow to happen? I mean, I think you are a person who is very much inside your work physically as you are, intellectually and emotionally. So you don't exclude, it's a totality of an experience that you bring to the work. So, I mean, is that accurate? Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't consciously take things from my surroundings. Well, recently I have been, but not generally. But I kind of see in hindsight what's going on with the paintings. And we've talked about this before, where, a body of work will come out, and then it's fairly obvious that it's come out in that way because of what I'm surrounded by. And so I've actually become very careful with what I have in my studio, because if there's a green bucket, that green or that bucket will end up somewhere. So, it's kind of, this sort of, again, like overlap between like what's going on. But I don't think it's really conscious. It's kind of about that with painting, for me, it's a dialogue between your eye and your body, and you kind of have to put your mind to the side in that process, like in that moment. So the intellectual and conceptual concerns are the same wherever I am, but you've got to kind of leave that noise out the door. And ironically, you then, by leaving that out the door, like the kind of thinking side of things, you get to the core of what your concerns really are through the doing. And if you're leaving your kind of intellectual mind at the door, I mean, for me, it's obvious that you would be influenced by your surroundings. And depending on where I am, there's, the light is completely different. For example, in Venice and also in the UK, but there was also a difference there. But there's a lot more of a human impact on the environment, whereas in Zimbabwe, the natural world kind of imposes itself. So all of those things like kind of feed in. And it's sort of, if you're responding to your environment, you're kind of paying attention, I suppose, but not in a directly conscious way. So, yeah.
Jonathan, how does that work in your practice? I mean, is that something, because your practice is, I mean, I think Helen is maybe an interesting example of somebody who's like so, eminently, responsive to things in the way that kind of is I don't know, I think it's kind of a role modeling for audiences, that they're dealing with human beings, that in a way that other artists are not as prone to sharing, right? I'm in a shit mood. This is the painting that happened. I was like, I just went to the circus. This is the painting that happened.
Sure, yeah. It definitely I would say I'm pushed myself into a kind of radical relationship within nature or the environment that I'm in, particularly environments that are stripped of kind of structure, human structure, so mountains and forests and so on. And I put myself in a kind of like radical vulnerability through sort of voluntary suffering and a kind of stripping away of my own human skin, if you like, which is really just an idea of oneself, this idea that this is where it ends and that's where it begins. I know we spoke about Guston as the kind of opposite of this, but he does speak about the studio where, you have everyone, including art history and your friends and your wife and your children, and they leave the room one by one. And if you're really lucky, even you leave, And I think that's the ideal. It does actually lead quite neatly into a question I was quite keen to ask you, which comes from seeing your work, particularly the last, let's say 3-4 years, where the figure has entered into it. And I'm fascinated and delighted to see how it's pretty apparent to me, it may be my own way of looking at it, that the figure and the landscape neither have priority. So the landscape feels as they're like one organic presence in the painting. And I'd just like to hear you speak about that, because it's something I love.
So this is actually a very consciously political decision that I've made throughout, because by doing that, I'm kind of placing myself in contraposition to Cartesian thinking, that like kind of places the human at the forefront and outside of the world, and that the world is kind of there to serve the human needs, but that's the only reason for it being. I've kind of much more into this sort of eco-feminist perspective that says the all too obvious thing to me, that we're completely entangled in the world. We're a part of an ecosystem, and we're one part in a sort of biodiverse dialogue with everything around us, and we're not really more important, even though we think we are. And so by putting sort of, for me, in paintings, the environment is the background, let's say, is saying as much as whatever's happening in the foreground. And again, like a lot of the artists that I'm interested in do this. So like Munch, for example, like a really good example is The Scream, where you've got this figure holding its ears, and the figure's screaming, but it's also holding its ears because the landscape is also screaming. And it's, I think that's kind of how I see it. But look at any Munch painting where you see that the environment is saying just as much as the figures that he populates it with. And I think the same thing happens with Cézanne. I was really, really interested in Cecily Brown's work about 4 or 5 years ago for the same reason. And there's a really great essay by Merleau-Ponty called Iron Mind, where he talks about Cézanne, and he talks about the painter and how in the painter's vision, objects jostle for space on the canvas, and there's kind of it's purely what's happening in your eyes. And it's weird because it's kind of a very kind of meta, kind of philosophical idea, but it's strongly rooted in like the things around us, and it's a very kind of political point, I think, because you're not prioritizing one thing, which is usually the figure above what's going on around.
I would also argue, interestingly enough, that's in many ways a default Zimbabwean painting position. Like if you that just filters into your work in a slightly different way, because one of the ongoing conversations that I have with a lot of artists is, and it has been around, just the foreground background conversation that doesn't seem to be a feature. And it's like, it's really like, if you look at Gresham's work, if you look at Wycliffe's work, like Wycliffe will paint like a bright red background, like he will almost deliberately put back like foreground colors into background, and not only get away with it, but succeed eminently. Or there's this kind of conversation with, like, we've had about trying to say, well, why is the foreground figure never genuinely foreground, and the background is always super active? And in a way, it becomes a philosophical position that is kind of somewhat different, is that who are you to judge what is the most important thing? It's also kind of saying, in a way, it's slightly different position to the one you're making, where the human being is not the apex of creation, but also equally, a human being is not necessarily the apex of creation, but the human being is not God. And we've made ourselves into a God in the Western tradition, in that sense of saying we having a delusion that we are in fact in charge, which is, anyone who's sitting like in a garden in Zimbabwe will realize you're not in charge, right? I mean, I'll just tell one tiny anecdote, which I, weirdly incorporated into some writing, and where the gardener who works in our garden, because I have no clue, and he's also the caretaker. Last year, he was asked to trim some plants, and he just ravaged them. He just chopped down, a whole lot. And I was devastated. I thought he ruined the garden. Like, I was so angry. I was so mad. And I'm like, how could you do this? I have to look at these. And he said, like, they'll grow back in a month. And I'm like, well, first of all, I don't believe you. Secondly, I have to look at these chopped down trunks. It was just horrifying. Lo and behold, 6 weeks later, not only did they grow back, like they're huger than ever, and it was kind of a mortifying experience, that about, they tell the stories that if humans were to disappear,
Yeah.
nature would entirely take over within 5 to 10 years. There would be no trace. So it's not so much as that, that delusion, but it's also knowing, like having and this was for me a palpable experience of how rapidly we would all disappear given just, a chance for nature to take over. But in that sense, Helen, I would argue that it's not that we're part of nature. I think in fact, we're not, in that sense. We're irrelevant, like, to the planet Earth. We have to make peace with, we have to negotiate for our role with nature in a humble way, because it will take over. It's not that we're not actually part of the ecosystem. We're just some kind of a weird extract that is just imagined, sort of like we are a UFO on this planet, and we have to negotiate for our survival because it's completely uncertain. Like Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about it.
Even though we're irrelevant, we have this special sort of anomaly, which is that somehow we can perceive and understand and purify, and certainly the opposite of purify, but we can kind of, like a crystal, we can deflect this sort of natural glow, what Cezanne called the hovering universe, the tentativeness of things. We can perceive it through our body and through our act. And you certainly do that as a painter, Helen. That's something that's so obvious. Your work is a kind of crystal hanging in the veranda of some lovely verdant place, shining with colors. I'm very grateful to have you in this world as an artist.
I think that it's a choice, and you can choose. You can choose to be irrelevant as humanity or as a human to the environment, but you can also choose to be part of the ecosystem. And I also think that we're irrelevant as humanity now because of kind of political things that have happened through history, where Western hegemony, Enlightenment theory, Cartesian thinking, and patriarchy have created this.
Go on, every box, Helen. Every box.
Just all the box, and like it doesn't have to be that way. As humanity, we can also choose to not make ourselves irrelevant, and I think that we have a job to do that. I mean, easier
on
said
what
than
terms though? I mean, look, of course it's a choice. I'm fairly happy to be irrelevant personally. I'll just say that because I don't think I can do much good. It's like I've proven time and time again through every experiment in the garden that I am entirely irrelevant to nature. But you know, I'm
you always say leave nature alone, and that's already something. You know, that's
yeah. But here's the thing, you know, like I think art actually is an intrinsically human activity, right? That is not of nature, that is intrinsically of human, and so that's kind of the approach. You know, I'm talking to two people who hike. That's all I have to say is that I'm in a minority here. I've got two people who have climbed things and had to be extracted from climbing projects. So, you know, and I have, you know, I'm definitely not winning on this one. But I just wanted to round off by asking, you know, just maybe share a little bit about the current project that you're working on, which I think is pretty interesting on numerous, because it's both local and political and somewhat different to what you've been doing. And I think it's, you know,
I'm doing a project. I received a DYCP grant from the Arts Council to do this project where I'm making portraits of people in the queer community in Harare. And I'm using the grant money to pay people to sit for me. So on one side, I have constant life drawing, which is great. And on the other, you know, space holding aspect to the whole thing. Because you end up, I'm not adopting the traditional artist model approach where the artist is kind of this kind of sadist saying you will sit there for 4 hours and don't move, you know. You talk about Freud doing that to his models somewhere. So it's more of a dialogue where they kind of dress how they want, they sit how they want, they move whenever they want, and which has been quite a challenge, because I'm very much like anchored to the person in front of me. It's not just kind of an academic exercise, but it's definitely been interesting because I'm drawing from a much wider pool of experience than my own experience, let's say. And I'm not sure where it's going to go. At the moment, I'm making drawings, but it's been, really interesting, and I hope ongoing as a project. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thanks so much for sharing with us, Helen.
Thank you so much, and great to see you.